Part 10. So the first 9 parts we're talking about George Wagner's childhood and his adolescence. Adulthood's not the word, adolescence, in relation to his family. Now it kind of shifted gears around here. There were some other random details. Nothing that I can really think of off the top of my head that I thought was real interesting. Basically, George didn't get along with anybody. And him and Jake were, polar opposites. So now is when we started getting into Tabitha. So naturally, George's version of events with Tabitha stopped lining up after about the time that they started dating. Now, I will give George credit. He was honest about the ages that they were when she was sleeping in his room and all of that. But that's not a good look. But, at least he was honest about that. So don't know about the rest, but, As if you can't tell, I'm already super uncomfortable with this because I really fucking hate discussing, the love lives of fucking 11 and 12-year-olds, which is the ages that they were when they were sharing a bedroom. 11 and 12. She was 11, for reference. But I get really fucking uncomfortable when we start talking about this because, yikes. So anyway, George said that they were set up by George's aunt. I forget her name. He said her name. I forget. It's Billy's sister. She tried to set Jake up with Tabitha, and Tabitha's sister, I don't see her name. I think it's Tess. I might have just made that up out of nowhere. Anyway, originally Tabitha was there for Jake. Her sister was there for George. Naturally, they swapped, which seems to be the case. And honestly, now that I've kind of seen it, I can see why. Because George is actually you could probably sit and talk to this guy. He seems like he would have been a nice guy had he not grown up in this environment. So originally the girls would stay at the house on Bethel Hill for weeks at a time until their mom came to get them. Tabitha was 11, George was 12. I don't know how old his sister was. And they would basically stay until their mom would come get them. Originally the girls slept in Jake's room and the boys slept in George's room. But after her sister stopped coming, they changed the sleeping arrangements. Angela wanted Tabby to sleep on the couch. George didn't like that. He offered to take the couch. Billy got pissed off about that. And they ended up sleeping in the same room because that is better than your son sleeping on the couch. Head over to part 11. Part 11, probably still a few trigger warnings on this one. Yep, definitely, because I already see we're getting into Hannah. So, trigger warnings for underage people. No assaults outright that are going on, but, just underage stuff in general. So just keep that in mind. This whole trial is one big fucking walking trigger warning. So about a year into this arrangement, George said that him and Tabby broke up because George was chasing another girl around. He said eventually this girl stopped talking to him and he got back with Tabitha. At this point, he described Jake meeting Hannah Roden at the Pike County Fair. He said that Hannah was chasing Jake around with a rabbit. Again, this poor rabbit did not ask for this. But that's how it started. Super inappropriate. Again, because Jake, he said at this point would have been 17 and George would have been 18. He said he looked at Hannah as a baby sister. John Parker asked if it had ever been anything more than that, and he said no, that he always looked at Hannah as a baby sister. He said that they would tell dirty jokes with one another, bake together, and talk about their shared struggles with weight loss. He said he also sometimes snuck her alcohol. He would put beer in different containers so that Jake wouldn't know that she was drinking. And the two would confide in one another if either of them was having an emotional day and needed to talk it out. And then he mentioned legitimately 4 separate times about Hannah telling dirty jokes with him and with Billy. And that's not me speaking badly on Hannah. That's just something that stuck out to me, that it got mentioned several times and I thought it was really weird. He was asked how Jake felt about George and Hannah having this close relationship, and George said that he didn't think his brother liked it because he always said that George was too close to Hannah. They pivoted the questioning and started asking about George's childhood again, about growing up in the Wagner household. George said that it was pretty typical, doing chores, watching TV, and then that changed when they got older. He said Jake became paranoid that he was going to hell and started berating everybody else and being mean and judging everyone else because Angela used to beat it in their heads that they were making Jesus cry whenever they did something that she didn't see as appropriate. George said Jake was terrified of going to hell. George did testify that he is somewhat religious, that he believes in God, but he doesn't believe God intervenes. He also said that he was unpopular and didn't get asked to hang out with his friends very much because they hated Jake. Head over to the next part. Part 12. We might break a record today for the most amount of parts that I've made about something because we ain't even into the crime or the afterwards yet. So George said that he was unpopular because of Jake, because none of his friends liked Jake and they didn't want Jake around because Jake was extremely rude and he had no filter. He told John Parker that he spent as much time away from Jake and his family as he possibly could. He said that as a family, they had good and bad days, but they had way more bad days than good days. And same with his brother. He said they were nothing alike and that really they were just kind of associates, not really like brothers. George said, quote, "My brother's extremely rude. He has no filter and he thinks he's better than everybody." George also said that his mother thinks she's better than everybody. And his summaries of what would you say your brother is like, what would you say your mother is like, were hilarious now that his family has turned on him. George testified that Jake would tell somebody if their house was too dirty or if they stunk and needed to take a shower. I assume that Jake probably had comments to George about his weight as well, because George brought up his weight a few times, which if you've seen pictures, George has lost a ton of weight in jail, which, the 3 hots and a cot will do that for you. And he is at the Scioto County Jail, which is here. And he's in that pod. They're in a big open pod. So, yeah. So he's been there for 4 years. Yeah, he's been in there for 4 years. George also testified that his brother Jake thinks that he's a saint and can do no wrong. And Angela says the same damn thing. And apparently Angela also told George that he should be more like his younger brother, her precious baby Jake. Let me tell you something, Jacob. Anyway, George said once they became adults that the two brothers barely interacted, and the only time they did was to work on a truck together, work on the farm together, build a fence, something like that, that they had to work together. George said that his uncle Chris Newcomb, which is Angela's younger half brother, that was only he said he was like a year older than him, was more like a brother to him than Jacob was. George said he was sick of Jake's behavior, constantly highlighting his flaws, telling him he was going to hell, that sort of thing. So, fair. That's fair. I still think George is a shitty, sucky person, but yeah, I'd probably get fucking sick of that too. So they kind of went back to Tabitha after this and started talking about George and Tabby's wedding day. We saw the picture. I've posted it before. You'll have to scroll back pretty far, and I don't have it on my phone anymore, or I would post it here. They did show him the wedding picture and asked him to identify everyone in it. So head to the next part. We'll get into that. Part 13. George testified that at his wedding to Tabitha, that it was a quote unquote catastrophe and that basically everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Something about the music was messed up. The power went out. There was a big storm that went through. Many of the things that they ordered for the wedding never arrived. But he said despite all this, it was a happy day and it was a happy memory and that he was happy to be marrying Tabitha and seemed to be very happy in this relationship. He said, quote, "We had a lot of really good days until she had her fits." So he then begins talking about Tabitha's problems. Naturally, he's the victim in all of this. He didn't treat her badly at all, and his mother never forced her to do anything. So he testified that, of course, he knew about Tabitha's past when she was younger. If you're interested in that, it's pretty rough, but you can scroll back to the videos about Tabitha's testimony probably about 4 weeks ago. And not only that, trigger warning for the next like 10 seconds. George testified that not only was her stepfather essaying her, but her mother was involved and would hold her down. So that's super fucked up. Don't know whether that's true. That's coming out of George's mouth, but that is horrific. Again, Tabby, if you watch these videos, please reach out. I would love to be friends with you. And I don't think that George is a victim here. I think you are. And honestly, I think we all think that because this family's fucking insane. And I'm so glad you got out with your life. So George testified that when Tabby was younger, she had episodes where she would rock back and forth and cry. And George said he could usually calm her down with a hug. But as she got older, they got worse. And they came with yelling, hitting, throwing things, biting. Hey, we made it to like 13 parts before I yawned. George said, quote, "It's not technically her fault. She had a rough life." He described the moment that he learned that Tabitha was pregnant as the best moment of my life. He was super excited over the baby, but it was short-lived. He said that he learned that Tabby had called him and said she had chlamydia, and he believed her when she said that the doctor told her it could lie dormant in you for years before emerging, and she went on some kind of antibiotic and cleared it up. But then she was diagnosed with it a second time, and he said, "I might be dumb once, but I won't be dumb twice." So he asked her, and she did confess to some infidelity with her friend's dad, as she testified. Next part. Part 14, how to take a small break to put my son to bed. So George described the learning that his son was coming, the pregnancy, as the best moment of his life. But from the chlamydia thing, the second time he learned that Tabitha was having an affair, she did testify to that. She testified that she was having an affair with her friend's dad. Not judging, a little weird, not judging though. You do you. And she has openly admitted that and admitted that it was wrong. As far as I know, as far as I remember. The infidelity obviously upset George, and he tried to leave the day that she gave birth to Bullvine in the hospital. Now, side note, have I told you this before? I'm not sure. I found out where Bullvine is from. It's from the movie The 13th Warrior. It's a character in the movie The 13th Warrior, because that is one of my brother's favorite movies. And when I was talking about this with him, when I said Bullvine, I said, I don't know where it came from. He immediately said, like, Bullvine from the 13th Warrior. And I looked it up, and that is what it's from. Naturally, George was really excited when his son was born, but it was overshadowed by the fact that this child could not be his. Tabitha begged him to stay with her, even though he tried to leave. He ultimately decided to stay, but did have a DNA test done, and he was, in fact, Bullvine's father, so they remained together. Now, Tabitha had told him, "You are, in fact, the father," Maury style. But when you're having an affair, I mean, I would understand him, wanting a DNA test. George also testified that Tabitha, as a mother, he said some things that were pretty degrading. He said that basically him or his mother took care of Bullvine most of the time, that it was rarely Tabby, and that Bullvine always seemed to get hurt whenever he was with Tabby, either falling off of something or coming out of the bathroom, out of a bath with a big knot on his head or something like that, which, some kids are just like that. So I don't necessarily think she was doing anything to it. George testified that he doesn't think that she was doing anything on purpose, with the exception of an incident where she put his hand in hot vegetables to get him to stop reaching for him. He said that Tabitha had told him about that he was not present for it, though. He said, quote, "Even her own mother said she couldn't handle raising a child." He said that he tried raising Bullvine despite Tabitha's fits and the couple's fighting, but that the dynamic inside the Wagner home, which is where they were living after they were married, we've established that, was obviously not helping anything. So head over to the next part and we will get into that. Part 15. So naturally, living with the Wagners was no treat, and it was not helpful to George and Tabby's marriage. George testified that he tried to leave his family a second time for Tabitha's sake. He said that he came home one day and he said Bullvine was like 2 months old. And he found him sitting on a kitchen counter and went looking for Tabitha. And trigger warning here. He said that he ultimately found Tabitha in the bathroom with a pair of scissors sitting in a pool of blood, and that she was hacking away at herself. He ultimately got the scissors away from her, calmed her down, and was trying to talk her into getting medical help. She didn't want that. He was saying, let's leave. Let's go to Alaska. Let's just leave. And if this is true, I don't know if it is, but if this is true, honestly, this is heartbreaking. That he did seem that he wanted, out of the two brothers, he did seem like the only one who wanted a life outside of his mom and dad, but I can't, attest to that. Tabitha, I guess, talked him out of it. That's what he testified to, saying that Tabitha talked him out of it, saying they had nowhere to go and no money, and that they would be better off to stay here with a roof over their head. I don't know about all that, but that is so sad. George testified that the third time he tried to leave his family, I don't think he tried that hard, was a fight between Angela and Hannah that spilled over to involve Tabitha, and George got mad at his mother and Hannah for dragging Tabitha into something that she wasn't involved with. He said, I was fed up with my mom, quote unquote. He said he packed their bags, but was once again swayed to stay when he was faced with the reality of his finances and that they had no way of supporting themselves because what money he did have was so tied up with his family. He did say that he regretted not leaving and said, quote, I just wish I hadn't turned around in Kentucky or in any of them, really. Speaking of his finances, he did confirm that the family's finances were intermingled. He said he didn't think it was weird because it had been like that his whole life, and that his mom had his credit card and his debit card numbers and was allowed to use the account for anything that the children or his child needed or wanted. His marriage did deteriorate and ultimately fell apart, ending with the fight that Tabitha testified to where she was running down the road, and we've heard about that one. Head to the next part. Part 16. So the night that Tabby left. So George obviously has a different recollection of events, as he would, because in Tabitha's version, he don't look so good. He said that Tabitha testified to this event in great detail. Like, she told us, minute by minute what happened. George was much more vague about it. He said that the fight began because Tabitha was trying to change Bullvine's diaper, but Bullvine was squalling. And he said that he went over and told her, I'll do it. You're being too rough with him. Tabitha got angry, picked up the child, and accidentally hit his head on a door frame while trying to storm out of the room. George ultimately took the baby, handed the baby to Hannah. This is Hannah Roden still. Handed the baby to Hannah, but he said at this point he was trying to calm down Tabitha, but she bit him and hit him with a board. And during all this, Angela pulls up. So naturally, Angela got involved, and, he says the board was thrown at him. Tabitha said the board was thrown at her by Angela, and Angela said the same thing, I think. He said the next time he saw Tabitha was when she was pedaling her bike up to the road. He said that he called the cops because he was concerned because she had attempted self-unaliving prior to this, like with the last incident. But this ultimately led to them getting a divorce. George said that he offered to hire an attorney for Tabitha. She said she wasn't interested. He said that Tabitha told him that he could have Bullvine and everything, that she just wanted out. And that she planned to leave Bullvine with him until her living situation improved, which she did also testify to. But there was paperwork done in the middle of this that there are conflicting accounts about. George also testified that right before he was arrested in November of 2018, in about, he thinks, September of 2018, he was served with papers that Tabitha was taking him back to court over custody of Bullvine. John Parker asked if at any point George had started to reject his upbringing that encouraged crime and bad behavior. George said he stopped partying when he got married, and sometime in 2014 resolved that he was going to stop committing crimes because he did not want that life for his son. He said, quote, "I was tired of looking over my shoulder and I didn't want my son eventually end up doing that life." Head over to the next part for the fun explanation of his family members. Part 17, I had to take a few minutes to let the uploads catch up because it was slowing down my recording rates. Okay, so next they asked George to describe his mother and his brother. So John Parker asked him how he would describe the members of his family. While describing Jake, he called him, quote, "selfish, greedy, a little jealous, and over-opinionated." While describing his mother, he said she, quote, "she thinks she's better than everybody," adding that she was over-opinionated and manipulative. About his father, George said that before he became a trucker and started abusing the drugs that made him into such a hair trigger, that his father was a good person. Parker also asked about Angela's relationship with the grandchildren. This is where George said that he thought that his mother was trying to start over with them because she saw George as a failure. He testified that his mother would regularly try to convince George to move out and just leave Bullvine with her. George did testify about building the goose house to go in the lake at the Flying W Farms. He said that his grandfather was obsessed with Canadian geese and he had goose houses for them. George testified that him and his brother built it in about 3 to 4 hours. They loaded it up in the back of his truck, drove it over to the Flying W. It was on a piece of styrofoam that was floating in the water, and it was weighted down with pieces of metal. He insisted he had no idea that the concrete buckets were there or what was in the buckets. We know from Jake's testimony and from the discovery that pieces of the murder weapons were in those buckets. After that, George testified about his tattoos. He said that he had a couple of them and that the one that everybody thought was a commemorative tattoo for the murders, was actually not. That he had a Cummins logo tattooed on his arm that the tattoo artist's son had done when he was younger. So the C, he said, looked okay, but the smoke and everything from around it looked like bubbles. He said his friends made fun of it and called it bubbles. So when his dad was going to get a tattoo, he offered George a cover-up and he paid for it. The tattoo artist did testify saying that he came up with the design himself, that these were all common elements of designs, and that is true. Here is the design, and if you look down in this region, you can see that it was a cover-up of some sort. And he's also not wrong that if he had a Cummins logo that was the big C and it was dark, he would have to get like an 8-ball to cover that. Head to the next part. We are on part 18. Now we're finally getting into some testimony about the murders themselves. So naturally, we couldn't get into like crime scenes and stuff because George claims he wasn't there and he didn't know anything about it. George denied knowing anything about the murders before or after. He said what his family had planned or the preparation process or the cover-up process. He didn't know anything about that either. He said that if he had known about it, he wouldn't have allowed it to happen. Just not any of my videos unless I start yawning like the old lady I am at 10:07. George testified that, quote, "one way or another, I would have never let it happen." He also testified that he goes to bed about 10 o'clock and wakes up around daylight, so he didn't know that Billy and Jake had left the house that night, and he didn't remember waking up at all that night. He said the next day he was down in McDermott, which is in Scioto County, helping tear down a building with his brother. when his mother called and told them to come home, and he found out about the homicides from the news. He said that Jake was sitting there very stoic and in shock. He testified that Billy kept calling, freaking out, saying that there were murders on Union Hill Road and that he couldn't get a hold of Chris Sr. And then he said that a friend called Jake to inform him, and that Jake then told the rest of the family, and then it was on the news. George said, quote, "It was more heartbreaking and more of a trauma than I'd ever been through in my life." Now, George was friends with Frankie. He, of course, said that he saw Hannah Roden as a little sister. He did know Chris. He was very good friends with Frankie's ex, Chelsea, and their son, Brentley, that he had been around Brentley a lot, that he had been around this entire family a lot, and he was heartbroken. He said that he took his four-wheeler on a ride up into the woods to calm down, which was his usual thing. And then when he came back to the house, that Jake was sitting on the couch in an unresponsive daze, and that Billy was sitting there trying to talk to Jake. Angela was in the kitchen with the children. Billy at this time was living at the Flying W, not on Peterson Road with the rest of the family. But he did stay with them for a few days afterwards, but eventually he started fighting with Angela and left and went back to the Flying W. George testified that they did, in fact, go to the funerals of those who were murdered. With the exception of Gary, they just went to his visitation. He said it was, quote, everybody's idea for them to go. George testified that while they were at the funerals, Jake showed very little emotion, but he didn't seem alarmed by this because that was normal for Jake. That Jake didn't show emotion. He'd never even seen his brother grin or smirk the way he did on the witness stand when he was describing the night of the homicides. Go to the next part. We are on part 19. I don't blame you for not watching all these in a row. I wouldn't either, because we're already at an hour. This is going to take me about 87 parts to upload all this shit to YouTube. Can't wait. So, they went to the funerals. George said that Jake showed, no emotion. He then said that when law enforcement began to have suspicions about the Wagner family, George said he thought that the police were just wasting their time. They're looking in the wrong places. Especially because they had already made accusations against James Manley, Bobby Joe Manley, and Leonard Manley. This was a sidebar, and they were initially persons of interest. We did go over some of that. They had a tracking device. I think James Manley ended up going to jail for a little while over destroying that. And Leonard Manley was the father, Dana's father, who had the same Pepal shoes. George also testified that he thought Leonard Manley had perhaps encouraged police in the Wagners' direction. He said he assumed this is because Jake had pissed off every single member of the Manley family. We went through a whole bunch of Alaska and back trips, so it made more sense now that they made a couple of them. They went up there to scout it out and decide if they wanted to move. They came back. When they came back, that is when the Montana interrogations happened. That's when they came back, packed up all their crap, took it back. That, on the second trip, is when they went in through Seattle, and the mom, Billy, and Angela, Billy, and the kids flew. And they shipped their car up there, but George and Jake were the only ones who drove up there. But they went through the U.S. and crossed in Seattle. Then when they came back is when Beth came with them. This is not when they had any kind of questioning at the border. And this is when they went to Springfield, Missouri, ultimately ending up back in Ohio. And I found out why it was Missouri. I thought that was a random place. They ended up in Missouri because of the R&L trucking job, according to George. They ended up there because the job that he took with Jake as a team driver, which means that the truck never stops running. One driver drives for 12 hours and then sleeps while the other one is driving. It was based out of Kansas City, but ultimately they ended up being based out of Wilmington, Ohio, which is not very far from here. It's kind of in between here and Dayton-ish. It's kind of draw a straight line from Cincinnati to Columbus and then another line to Dayton, and it's kind of where all three of them intersect, roughly. Anyway, went off on that for a little too long. Go to the next one and we will talk about the interrogations at the border. We are on to part 20. This is the interrogations at the Montana border. Also, cheers to my Manjaro bitches. I couldn't find the big pack of the regular Core Power ones at Sam's Club. All I could find were these and the elite ones that are the 42 milligrams. And I don't want to drink a 42 milligram at 10:30 at night. So anyway, George said at the border when they were in interviews that they were intercepted. They were all taken in different rooms. And that George was basically questioned about his mother and brother's involvement in the Roden murders. Now, he claims he didn't know anything about these murders up to this point, that he thought they were barking up the wrong tree, and he never dreamed that his family was involved. George said, quote, I didn't believe what they were saying, but he told the jury that he agreed to spy on Jake for BCI. Seems awful quick to flip on your brother. Now, we know when they got back in the car, they didn't talk about anything, but they did take Bullvine and Sophia to an emergency room because they were convinced that the BCI had drugged them, or the border agents had. That's a whole another paranoid side bit. But George said at this point, he came out point blank and asked his brother if he had anything to do with the homicides. He said, quote, he swore up and down that he didn't know who did it and they had nothing to do with it. I had no reason not to believe him. Ultimately, the Wagners ended up back up in Alaska. This is when Jake met Beth. They got jobs, whatever. Jake and George both. George testified. Sorry, I'm getting really tired. This is when they met Beth and everything. He testified that he got laid off from his job. Jake did as well, and that it is too expensive in Alaska. So that is when they decided to come back to the lower 48. And Jake wanted Beth to come, but Beth wouldn't come unless she was married. Now, at some point, I assume in Alaska, I kind of missed the details on it. When he first met Beth, he talked about a dinner that she came to at the Wagner house to meet the family. George had made some kind of, he said, like steak and lime Mexican meal. And that him and his dad, anytime that they had Mexican food, wanted to drink a beer at dinner, which, okay, whatever. But that Angela and Jake were flipping the fuck out about it because it was making a bad impression to Angela, to Beth, making them look like a bad family. Ultimately, after being laid off, Jake and Beth did get married. They moved the next day. We have heard all about that. And they came back to Kansas City, Missouri, and Springfield, Missouri. Billy was excited to go back to the Flying W with his dad. Go to the next part. Part 21. So at this point, they have come back to Missouri. Jake and his wife Beth are there. Angela's there. The kids are there. Billy was excited to go back to the Flying W. George took him straight there and then came back to Missouri. They then found out that the job in Missouri was ultimately a bust, but that they could get a team driving position in Wilmington, Ohio. George said that he had resolved to move back for the job with or without his family. Angela didn't like the idea, didn't want to go back, didn't want Sophia growing up around that sort of thing because, fuck Bullvine, I guess. Like, just worry about Sophia. Which, yes, we should worry about Sophia. Her fucking mother was murdered by her father, but you know what I mean. George told his mother he was going to move back regardless of whether they stayed or went, and he was taking his son with him, and that apparently was enough to sway Angela. And George and Jake followed, moving back to Ohio shortly after Angela and the children. This is when they moved to South Webster into Angela's father's house, who had passed away while they were in Alaska. Also, fun fact, Angela's father, when they were talking about a security system, they had to put their security system that they had on their house, they took it down and put it on her dad's house because her dad sold pills for a living and had somebody break into his house and like beat the shit out of him and take his bag of money and his bag of pills. And I want to say I remember that. That was in South Webster, and I want to say I remember that. So they touched briefly on... What are y'all doing? My dog and my cat are being dumb. They touched on Beth and the wiretap recordings. George said he didn't trust Beth after Sophia's allegations, and then said that he'd suspected BCI was listening to his phone conversations in the semi-truck he drove with Jake. He said, my father raised me to always assume that I was being recorded. And I assume this is why he said he agreed to spy on Jake, allegedly at the border, so that it would make sense why he was saying the things he was in the wiretaps. George also said he had no idea that the truck that his dad bought from his uncle was used to commit the homicides until he learned about Jake's plea deal. He said that the announcement of the plea deal shocked him, that in jail, a officer came to get him, took him back to booking where Rick Nash was, and Nash met with him to let him know that Jake had taken a plea deal, and George wrestled with that because he thought that his family could never have anything to do with this. Go to the next part. Part 22, guys. We are getting there. So after George learned about Jake's proffer deal, which a proffer deal is the plea deal before it's accepted, I guess. Didn't know that was a word until this trial. When he learned about it, Richard Nash met him at the jail, delivered the news to him. George said that at first he thought his brother had just gone crazy in jail because Jake is not a social person and doesn't get along well with other people, and that he was just under the pressure of jail. George said that Nash delivered the news to him and that he didn't think Richard would lie. But he still didn't believe his brother was capable of murdering 8 people. He said the news made him feel heartbroken and betrayed because he defended his brother in the years after the murders. And in what I believe is the biggest downplaying of this fucking trial, George said he experienced similar feelings when months later his mother changed to a guilty plea. He said, quote, I just couldn't believe they were capable of it. I have a hard time dealing with it, yes. He was asked how it felt to have your mother testify against you. George took a very long pause, and his voice did kind of show some emotion here. And he said, quote, it was emotionally hard considering she wouldn't even look at me. He said that Angela was lying, that he never told her anything about a footprint at the scene. As far as motive, George says he had no idea why any of his family members thought Sophia was being abused because no one in Hannah's family would ever harm a child. He said he hadn't been aware there were significant custody issues between Hannah and his brother Jake. Okay, that whole thing's fucking bullshit and you know it. It is. Like, there's literally shit that says that he knew otherwise. Anyway, he also said he did not know that his mom bought those shoes from Walmart, but he was in the truck at the time. That he didn't know anything about the purchases made with his credit card to make a silencer. That his mother did have permission to use his credit card for things that his son needed or wanted, but I don't think your kid wants an oil filter, but whatever. They then spent like 100 years going through the list of guns for the guns that they did have and don't have. This list was on Jake's phone. It was originally made February 11th, 2015 and was last modified on May 1st of 2015. This is a full year before the murders and was edited 11 months before the murders. George used Snap-on tools as an example for Jake making wish lists of things, not necessarily things he has, but the list would include some things that he had as sort of a checklist. He also denied seeing half the guns on that list. George did testify that he liked guns and he was an outdoorsman, so that's not surprising. And he did also testify that he would buy, sell, trade guns as well, which is very common around here too. Last part 22. Last part for today. All right, part 22, we have like one paragraph to go over. So this is at the end of his testimony for the day. I think they wrapped up around 4:30 or so. John Parker asked George how he felt knowing that Jake had pled guilty. George paused before answering this said, and he did. He seemed to really think about the answers about his family. He says, quote, I really don't even like calling him my brother anymore. I'm ashamed that my family would do something like this. Parker then asked how he felt about his mother. George said, quote, I have the same feeling towards her. Now, that is all for today. That was the end of the testimony. Finally! gone through like 8 drinks and 4 snacks sitting over here. All right, so one more thing that I want to talk about. Now, yes, George is an unfortunate circumstance because outside of this raising, George probably would have gone on to become a decent person. That being said, he was not. This is who George is, and he is not a decent person. He is a monster. I don't know if he's quite on the same monster scale as his brother, but he's a monster. And sure as fuck not on the same scale as his mother. George is giving off the same air as someone who is on the outside, newly outside of a cult. Because this family was that. This family was a cult. And it was just a matter of time before something like this happened that would cause it to implode dramatically. I wish it hadn't been this, but here we are. Now, it is easy to feel sorry for somebody who has been that's now out of this cult, that is now out of the control of someone else. But nothing that happened to him in this family dynamic and in this family situation justifies or excuses murdering and slaughtering a family of 8. And I include Hannah Gilly in this family because she was intending on marrying Frankie and did have a son with him. It doesn't matter what happened to you. It doesn't justify doing this. And that's what we need to remember here is that, yes, George is an unfortunate victim of circumstance. But the fact remains, so are a lot of other people, and they do not murder other families. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a great night and a great day. I love you. I got too excited. The last part was not, in fact, part 22. It was part 23 because that makes it better. But we're done for the day. Now, I do want to point out that I personally am not convinced that George, I got to take all my snacks back in the kitchen and throw my trash away. I'm not personally convinced that George necessarily pulled any triggers, and I don't think that they've proved that at all. But what I do think is that they are doing a pretty good job at proving that he either knew about it ahead of time and helped prepare or helped cover it up afterwards. And honestly, it doesn't matter which one, because in the state of Ohio, you don't have to pull the trigger to be found guilty of aggravated murder. And he's not charged with, some kind of murder that has a specific, premeditation, pull the trigger type of thing. If he knew, he's guilty because Angela was being charged with the same thing. And at no point has anyone argued that Angela was there. Now, I've heard some people on the internet say they think Angela was there, which is absolutely insane to me. That bitch was not there. She was at home pulling the strings, like always. So it is important to note that the state of Ohio does not require you to pull the trigger to be found guilty of aggravated murder. Now, again, not an attorney. My attorney friend, dear God, I hope she doesn't watch these because I probably give her an aneurysm. Hi, Rachel. Fun fact, Rachel's also a Richard Nash stan, so I stress her out for that too. But the ultimate bottom line here is that George does not have to be found guilty only by being there. He can know about it and help cover it up, help prepare whatever, and still be found guilty for aggravated murder. All right, I just opened the door to let my dog out. Stand by. What in the actual fuck is that? I mean, obviously not what is that. I'm not fucking stupid. I know that's snow, but wow. I love snow. I love winter. My house looks like this. But wow.